Hello listeners. This is the reading of the Sabbath School lesson for the fourth and final quarter of 2022.
The series is titled On Death, Dying and the Future Hope. The author is Dr. Alberto Tim, while your readers are Percy and Sibylla Harrold. Lesson 2 is ready for teaching on October 8. It's titled Death in a Sinful World, and I'm Percy Harrold. Thursday, October 6, the first Gospel Promise. Read Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 and 21. What hope can we find in these verses for all of humanity? Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And verse 21, also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. Genesis chapter 3 describes the dreadful tragedy that took over the world after the fall. Everything changed, and Adam and Eve could see the contrast between what the world used to be and what it had become. But in the midst of their frustration and despair, God gave them assurance for the present and hope for the future. First, he cursed the serpent with a word of messianic hope. He declared, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel, in Genesis 3:15. The word enmity, or Hebrew Eibah, E-Y-B-A-H in the English, implies not only a long-lasting cosmic controversy between good and evil, but also a personal repulsion to sin, which has been implanted by God's grace in the human mind. By nature we are completely fallen, as we read in Ephesians 2, verse 1, and you he made alive who were dead in trespasses in sin, and verse 5, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. And slaves of sin, as we read in Romans 6, verse 20. For when you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. However, the grace that Christ imparts in every human life creates in us enmity against Satan. And it is this enmity, a divine gift from Eden, that allows us to accept his saving grace. Without this converting grace and renewing power, humanity would continue to be the captive of Satan, a servant ever ready to do his bidding. The Lord next used an animal sacrifice to illustrate this messianic promise, as we read in chapter 3 of Genesis and verse 21. Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. Ellen White writes in The Story of Redemption, page 50, when Adam, according to God's special instructions, made an offering for sin, it was to him a most painful ceremony. His hand must be raised to take life, which God alone could give, and make an offering for sin. It was the first time he had witnessed death. As he looked upon the bleeding victim writhing in the agonies of death, he was to look forward by faith to the Son of God, whom the victim prefigured, who was to die man's sacrifice. End of quote. Read 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, and Hebrews 9:28. What do these texts teach about what was first revealed in Eden? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And Hebrews 9:28, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. Knowing that they would eventually die, as we read in Genesis 3:19 and 22-24, Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. Let's read those texts. Genesis 3:19, in the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. And verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man is become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever, therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to guard the way to the tree of life. But they did not leave naked or with their own fig leaf coverings, as we read about in Genesis 3:7. God himself made tunics of skin for them, and he even clothed them. Genesis 3:7 reads, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. And Genesis 3:21, also for Adam and his wife the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them, a symbol of his covering righteousness, as we read about in Zechariah 3:1-5. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to oppose him. And the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire? Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments, and was standing before the angel. Then he answered and spoke to those who stood before him, saying, take away the filthy garments from him. And to him he said, see, I have removed your iniquity from you, and I will clothe you with rich robes. And I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head, and they put clothes on him, and the angel of the Lord stood by. And Luke 15:22, but the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and sandals on his feet. Hence, even back then, right from the start in Eden, the gospel had been revealed to humanity. This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.